good afternoon. My name is Stacy and I'm the communications manager for the Drexel Libraries. And I just wanted to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the webinar, Personal Digital Archiving, How to Keep Your Stuff Safe, which is being presented by our digital archivist, Sarah Newhouse. Today's webinar is part of the library's new event series that we're calling Wednesdays at Noon, which brings together expert library staff and members of the Drexel community for weekly training sessions and different discussions. As you may have guessed from the title, these Wednesdays at Noon events are held every Wednesday at 12 p.m. and we're holding them throughout the winter and the spring term. So stay tuned for lots of other events coming up. You'll find all the details on our website, which I'll share in the chat in a second. And just as a quick reminder, we're recording all of our sessions. So if you miss one or if you want to go back and rewatch something, you can find all of the recordings on our YouTube channel. And again, I'll send out a link to the recording once it's been posted. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, great. So hi, thanks for attending this webinar, How to Keep Your Stuff Safe, about applying digital archives principles to your digital stuff so that you or anyone else can access it in the future. I'm Sarah Newhouse, as the title screen says. I'm the digital archivist in the Drexel University Archives. The tips I'm going to give you in this webinar are intended for people who are not involved in the digital archives, digital forensics, digital libraries, or IT fields. I'm going to try to give you a range of practices and options that will work no matter what your particular tech setup is, but they're all based on digital preservation and digital archives management principles that can be applied to a range of file types, systems, and habits. And of course, there's always more that you can do. So I'll include resources at the end of the presentation if you're interested in more details or if you'd like to do something that's a little bit more involved. It may go without saying, but like with so many other practices in life, exercise, parenting, interior design, pet training, the best personal digital archiving practices are the ones that work for you. So you decide what level of risk you're okay with and what level of effort you want to put into preserving your digital documents, and then make decisions based on that. Doing something is always better than doing nothing. So if you adopt just one practice that I go over today, you'll be doing a good thing for your future self and everyone else's ability to access those files. I'm going to pivot briefly for a very short explanation of why digital preservation is, unfortunately, so complicated. Let's look at one of the primary differences between digital and paper-based archives. With paper-based archives, so books, letters, diaries, printed photographs, blueprints, you can treat them with benign neglect and they'll still be usable in the future. You can leave an item, or in this case, we have a land deed from before the Civil War that was printed on vellum. You can leave it on a shelf for 50 years, not touch it, and it's still accessible. You can still open it, read it, get information out of it. And the same is true of most physical objects in optimal conditions, or even sometimes suboptimal. The Dead Sea Scrolls were in a cave for 2,000 years. We can still get information out of those. You can't do that with digital archives. If you leave a hard drive or a server or a floppy disk in a closet for even just 5 or 10 years, let alone 2,000, you're probably going to have some problems getting to the data it contains. And this is because of a few issues that are unique to digital media. The first is technological dependency. With paper-based archival materials like a photograph, you just have to look at the object in order to get information from it. You can't do that with digital files because of technological dependency, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that a digital file is dependent on technology, so software, hardware, and people who know how to use both, in order to be accessed. All digital files have technological dependency in that we need computers to access them, so there are some obvious limitations on how and when we can get to data in our digital files. You can't crack open a floppy disk and find out what's on it just by looking at it. The negative side of technological dependency is technological obsolescence. Obsolescence is a problem for both hardware and software. This happens when a company produces a new version of something that can no longer interact with older versions or the files produced by older versions. like when computer companies stop producing machines with ports for specific kinds of cables built into them. So you can no longer plug in a zip disk drive without an adapter, or use the same charging cable for your iPhone. Or like when game consoles' latest versions won't play games designed for previous versions. Tech companies do this deliberately so that you will continue to buy their new products. Obsolescence is a feature, not a bug, of the tech industry. And lastly, the sheer volume of digital materials is often a barrier to finding and accessing things in the future, aka the too much stuff problem. This problem exists in paper-based archives too, but we as a species are now generating digital documents at such an accelerated rate. It's easy to get overwhelmed with how much stuff there is to save. It's just so easy to create new digital material. And as a future user or an archives researcher, it's then hard to sift through, say, 500 Word documents to find exactly the one you're looking for. So at a certain point, saving everything becomes counterproductive if it means you'll have trouble finding what you want when you need it. So what can you do in the face of corporations forcing obsolescence, software being discontinued, and a growing mountain of content to save? Well, there are a couple things. The first thing you can do to make your files easier to access in the future is to deliberately decide what to save. This is also called appraisal. Just like how archivists decide what to keep in the archives, you can also decide which of your files are worth saving for years. So go through your files at the end of a project, or on some kind of schedule, or just whenever you feel like it, like after this webinar maybe, and make decisions about what you really need to keep. Base your decisions on what will be useful to you in the future, or maybe you have a user in mind, like your children or people studying your work. Do you really need all 7 drafts of that research paper? Or is the final version what you'll want to use in the future? And all those photos from your birthday party, do you need 30 versions of the same image with just slightly different facial expressions on your friends? Or can you pick your favorite and just keep that one? Don't be afraid to delete things, but also try to make careful choices when you do, and consider how you might use these files in the future. In the end, you'll be making these files easier to find when you don't have to wade through 30 identical photographs to find the best one, or try to figure out which version of your class paper was the final one. The second thing you can do is to describe and name your files in a way that makes sense to you or your future user and helps prevent problems opening them later. There are some file naming best practices you can adopt from the digital preservation world, like no special characters. So don't use ampersands, dollar signs, emoji, letters with diacritics. Software will often have trouble opening files with these special characters in their titles, so including them is setting yourself up for trouble later on. You should also make the file and folder names meaningful or descriptive to you, a human person. What that means is using full words and including dates. Ideally, you want these file names to make sense if you were to encounter this file or folder just by itself on a disk or sitting on your desktop. And there are some examples there that I'm sure you can read. You can also embed descriptions in your files using tools like Adobe Bridge or the Info tab in some of the Microsoft Office software or in iPhoto. This is a bit of an advanced step, but adding this additional information will make your files easily searchable and will also help you understand what's in them when you encounter them later. You should also be mindful of the format that you're saving your files in. And here's where we're going to get a little bit technical. So many pieces of software create or use closed proprietary formats, which just means that the company making the software owns the technical data about that file format, and they keep it a secret. This makes it hard for other companies to create software that can use those files, since they don't have the necessary information about the file format. Proprietary file formats tend to only open in one program, often the program that created them, and therefore have huge risk of obsolescence if that program stops being made, or the company that owns that file format decides to change literally anything about it. Some really common file formats are actually proprietary, like Photoshop PSD files and AutoCAD DWG files. If you're creating and saving proprietary files, you need to be very aware of the fact that whether or not you can access them in the future is largely out of your control and dependent on a company continuing to do the same thing for years, even when it's not profitable anymore. But do your own investigation here. Understand the relationship between your files and their software, but also know the relationship between the proprietary software you use and the rest of the world. You may decide that some risks are worth taking because the companies controlling the proprietary file format are so large that it seems unlikely that the format will just disappear overnight. Or because there's so much international pressure to keep their files interoperable that it seems unlikely that they'd do anything to change that. So mostly talking about Microsoft and Adobe here. So Microsoft files are a lower risk than some niche formats that are only used in small industries but are still proprietary. The safest thing to do if you work with proprietary files on a regular basis is to also save a copy in an open format. Open formats are the opposite of closed proprietary formats in that the information about them and their standards is freely available, so multiple companies can build software that uses these files. Open file formats tend to be available across different systems, different software, different apps. So saving your files in one of these formats will probably make them more accessible in the future just because you'll have more options to open and use them. That said, saving something as open often means you're losing some data in the process. Saving an Excel workbook as a CSV means that you can very likely open that CSV in whatever spreadsheet program we're using in 20 years, but it also means you lose any formulas you had in that workbook. Likewise, for saving Word docs as TXT files, like in this example, those are the same file on the left and right, just open as a doc file and open as a text file, or saving PSDs as JPEGs. This is absolutely the most complicated thing I'm asking you to consider today, but it's something that will be increasingly important as the tech industry keeps moving forward and the trash heap of unsupported file formats only gets larger. Also, don't worry if you didn't memorize which file formats are open and which are proprietary. There are a bunch of online resources to help you tell the difference, and I'll include some at the end of the presentation. And as an addendum to the file format discussion, you should also not save your files with compression, encryption, or passwords on them. I'm going to kind of gloss over these because, one, if you work with files that can be compressed or encrypted, you probably already know anything I would tell you during this short overview webinar. And two, this gets complicated really fast, especially with audio and video files. If you are unsure about compressed formats, though, the easiest thing to do is just to save your file in whatever format it was generated. So if your camera captures TIFF files, then great, that's an open format. Save those. If it generates JPEGs, those are fine. The thing you want to avoid is compressing your files down so much that you lose data. But unless you're regularly working with large files and mostly multimedia files, you probably don't have to worry about this one too much. Another thing you can do to protect your data is keep multiple copies. This may sound like it's not helping the too much stuff problem, but the difference here is that we're keeping multiple copies of the same file that we've already decided to keep, and we're doing it in a deliberate way to prevent file loss or destruction. But where you keep those copies matters. It's really easy to think that your digital files are safe just because you've taken the action of saving them, whether that's on your computer, an external hard drive, or a cloud-based storage option like Dropbox, Google Drive, or iCloud. But there are some problems with that assumption. Files stored on a piece of physical equipment like your computer, your phone, a CD, if anyone uses those anymore, or a flash or a jump drive, they're only as safe as the locations where that drive is. Those files are susceptible to loss because they're stored on one physical medium. They could be stolen, they could be lost in a fire, they could be damaged by dropping it, damaged by water, any number of things. And if you lose that storage device, you've lost your files. But files only stored in the cloud are also at risk because they're out of your control. And I hope by now, in the year of our Lord, 2021, we all know that there is no cloud, there's only someone else's computer. Those files in Dropbox are susceptible to server malfunctions, to hacks, to corruption, and to destruction from natural disasters at the site of the servers, someone else's computer. And perhaps more realistically, you're likely to lose access to them precisely because you don't control or own those servers. So the servers providing you with that storage can decide at any time to take it away, to charge you money for it, or more money. Or you could lose access to your stuff just because you forgot your password or you got hacked. One rule to guide your storage practices is the 3-2-1 rule, in which you save 3 different copies on 2 different kinds of media and 1 in a different geographic location. So that's 3 different copies of the same file on at least 2 different kinds of media, for example, 1 in cloud storage and then 2 of them on your computer, or vice versa. And you want to keep 1 of those 3 copies in a different geographical location. This could be as easy as backing things up to a hard drive that you keep at your parents' house, or as complicated as keeping a backup of your servers in a different geopolitical or geographic zone, which is something that large corporations consider. If your servers are in the European Union and the transatlantic cable is damaged, you will be very happy that you also kept data on local servers in the United States. I once worked at a library that managed this part of the 3-2-1 rule by backing all of our servers up to tape every day and having the IT guy carry the backup tapes home with him at night. So if the on-site servers went down overnight, we still had a copy of everything. But of course, this would be useless if all of Philadelphia was flooded or fell into the Schuylkill, but this was the level of risk that the library was comfortable with. And of course, whatever you decide to do with all of these suggestions, have a consistent system. Whatever way you divide up your files for coursework at Drexel, keep doing it the entire time you're in school. Migrate all of your photos to your second storage location once a year or once a month, or set it up to automate every night at midnight. Make sure all your photos are JPEGs or TIFFs, but pick one. Establish a draft and a final draft file naming policy and then do it for every paper. Basically, just evaluate the level of risk you are comfortable with or the things you think you need to worry the most about. Come up with a system that addresses your needs and stick with it. So those are some of the tips from the world of digital archives and digital preservation that you can use to help keep your files accessible for years to come. None of these are guarantees, of course, but doing any of the things that we went over today will increase the chances that your files will still be accessible in the future. And of course, if you have any questions about any of this, you can contact me at the email address on the screen. Or if you have questions about the Drexel University archives, you can always reach the whole staff. It's just 3 of us. We're all very friendly at the archives@drexel.edu email address. And honestly, that one has a higher chance of getting answered quickly because 3 people check that email. And here's the list of resources that I refer people to pretty often. There are a bunch more out there that I'm sure you can find by Googling, or I'm happy to recommend things if you have specific concerns. I will leave this up on the screen while we open the floor to questions. So type a question into the chat or unmute yourself to ask. But either way, thanks for attending.
Thank you so much, Sarah. If anybody has any questions, as Sarah said, you can put them in the chat and I can read them out loud.
Also, do feel free to email me with questions afterwards.
Sarah.
Hi, yes.
Sarah, I thought that was a great presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, when the video of this is ready, I can think of a few family members who I can share it with. Your story about storage of backup files.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite, old history stories is at MCP Hahnemann before the merger with Drexel, when we first moved the catalog online. The legendary Ian actually used to back up the files onto discs and took them home and stored them in a box under his bed.
It's not terrible. It's better than nothing.
They were there.
Yeah, Rachel in the chat just said, thank you for pointing out the cloud is someone else's computer. This is one of my favorite things to blow people's minds with. It works less now. I feel like about 5 to 10 years ago when the cloud was a new thing, this was something that no one had thought of. And there was all of this marketing around put your stuff in Dropbox, put it in the cloud, cloud storage solutions for your business. And it seemed like the cloud was just this nebulous, safe place where your data could live forever. And I think these days that's less of a common belief. But for a while it was really popular. And digital archivists were all panicking about it.
As we all know, sometimes hard drives and computers, just stop working apparently for no reason.
Yep.
Are there any tools you can recommend for, checking to see if there's data corruption or, otherwise preventing, losing data just because something just stops turning on?
Yeah. There's a number that I have stuck in my head, which I'm not sure is accurate anymore. It may have changed, but the old number for migrating your content from one media to another used to be 5 to 7 years. So one of the things you can do to sort of get ahead of data corruption and problems with media failing is just every 5 to 7 years, you move your stuff. So if you have an external hard drive full of photos or documents or data that you're really worried about, then make a point of every 5 to 7, you move it to a new hard drive, or you migrate it to a different, you update your server software or hardware. That may have changed, but I still think 5 to 7 is a pretty safe estimate. Unfortunately, one of the problems with data corruption and bit rot, which I actually took out of this presentation because, for one, it's rare. Like, this will likely not happen to you. But one of the problems with that is unless you're using a robust preservation system, like the kind that an archives or library or museum would use, you're probably not going to notice it until you try to open a file. You can minimize that by how damage to data happens when a file is being edited or moved. But rot is just going to happen. Not common, but it will just happen, where one of the ones and zeros of the binary data that makes up a file, one of those zeros flips to a 1, and all of a sudden the whole file is corrupted. But it's not common, and the things you can do to mitigate against it are usually pretty successful, like migrating the media you store your stuff on every 5 to 7 years, and having a copy of a file that you just don't touch. But that's a great question, and unfortunately kind of a complicated answer.
I have a question, Sarah.
Sure.
I have a ton of photos of my children, and for some reason, well, not for some reason, but I have more print photos of my older daughter for obvious reasons. I do now of my younger daughter because everything is digital now. So everything I have is mostly all inside of my phones and old phones and things like that. So what is your recommendation on backing up photos? Do you still recommend just various cloud methods? Because I know some people have said, save a copy in, Gmail, or make maybe various Gmail accounts and use, take a storage methods. Do you have a recommendation on which methods to use when it comes to photos? Because I know there are actually like services that you can pay for. I've seen, and they'll charge you to keep your things safe as well. So there's just so many options out here.
There are, and I mean, like I said at the beginning, the best thing is the one that's easy for you within some best practices and standards. But I think it's probably easiest to consolidate everything in one place. So if you have some photos that are on your phone and some that are printed, I would say either scan the printed ones and then just consolidate them with the ones on your phone and put all of those in one storage location. But also saving the copies on 2 different kinds of media. So have all of the photos, in Dropbox somewhere or in, Google Photos, and then also have them all on a hard drive. But the thing that I actually recommend people do for family photos and things that you want to give to your kids or to their kids in 30, 40 years is print them out. I mean, maybe something weird for a digital archivist to recommend, but it's another level of stability. So if you lose access to your Google Drive account, or if Google Drive doesn't exist in 30 years, you'll still have the printed photographs. And you can write names on the back of them, which is a long tradition that archivists love finding in family photographs, when people have actually labeled them on the back. So I would say try and consolidate them, scan the printed ones, maybe print your favorite of the digital ones, and then for everything that's digital, just follow the guidelines from the presentation. Put everything in somewhere on the cloud and somewhere on physical media.
So I should still follow the 3-2-1 rule as well with photos?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It's complicated when you've got print and digital stuff that you want to save, and you're trying to follow the same guidelines for both, but there are ways to bring everything together.
Thank you.
Also, if you have more specific questions about it, please email me later.
All right, there's nothing in the chat. So then I think if it's okay with you, Sarah, we will end the session. And again, feel free to contact Sarah after we're done here.
Thanks, everybody.